All right, so a couple of reminders. So we didn't have class on Tuesday, so you had the opportunity to crawl the campus while it was still bustling with activity to do this, to find a system on campus that you could identify some key elements of, variables of, components of, and then draw a causal loop diagram and be able to identify the endogenous, exogenous, and excluded variables, give a little description of it, and for extra credit, then see if you can identify a systems archetype that is present in it. So that is due soon, that assignment B1 up here. But I also added in an additional assignment, but I also added in, because I wasn't originally planning on this assignment, I increased the drop policy from 5 to 6. So if you wanted to ignore this assignment, you could, and it wouldn't make any difference. But if you want the extra opportunity, this is an auto-graded assignment that gives you practice on archetypes. I noticed in a lot of the muddiest points, people were saying that would like to see more examples, and we were going to see examples today of the different archetypes, but this gives you an idea. Basically, most of the assignment is here's an example system. What archetype does it best match to? So that is the assignment, additional unit comprehension assignment for this unit. And other reminders is that unit C is next week. And next week's the only week where I ask you to do 2 readings in 1 week. Just the only way I could line it up. So there is a kind of an introductory reading on resilience on Tuesday, and then a more detailed topic of critical slowing down on Thursday, which relates to resilience. And so those two should fit together, dovetail with each other pretty well. And I'm currently working on the reading exercises for both of those. And the only other reminder is the muddiest point, as usual, on Sunday. I believe all of the B1s that have already been turned in, I've graded, so you should have grades, and then I tried to put feedback there where I could. And I think that's it. So any questions on administrative stuff? I'm sorry, I have something in my throat today, so I might have a lot of clearing. Okay, so what today is, we're wrapping up this, the end of unit B here. So we talked about systems archetypes, we've seen them in the abstract, and now I just want to spend today giving some examples from historical examples or everyday examples or whatever that fit these archetypes and show how to use them. And so when we talk about systems archetypes, very often the sort of big trap that they identify is this thing that I want to define called bounded rationality. This is a term you should know. And this is, it's this term bounded should remind you of the boundaries of a system. So what bounded rationality is decision-making that is rational if you consider some model system which isn't including all of the most important variables. And so if your mental model of all the important things that are in the system is too small, so you haven't included enough endogenous and even exogenous variables, then subject to your model, you've made a very rational choice. But because you haven't included some other important things that are really actually, driving some of the dynamics of the system, because you've left them out, then you've overlooked a problem with your solution or a better solution that you could have picked. And so I'll show examples of that here. So in a lot of these examples, what we'll see is that a decision is being made based on sort of an overly simplistic view of a system. And once we include all the other variables in the system, how people respond to the decision, things like that, then it starts being clear that maybe some other decision should have been made. So, I'm just going to sort of roughly say this is decision-making that is rational only when considering an overly simplistic model of reality, or of whatever the real question is that you're trying to solve. And it's kind of an abstract definition here, but again, we're going to see examples of this, and a bunch of the different ones I have here are pretty much examples of bounded rationality. So this is a decision-making trap. It is often a source of falling into systems traps. So it's sort of a meta trap. It is like that. So I would view bounded rationality as a form of trap. So it's kind of one of the biggest traps when we talk about systems thinking. So what do I mean by that? So the kind of classic example of this, so I'll say classic example of bounded rationality is the crime spiral, or I'll say specifically the drug crime spiral. What does that look like? All right, so now we get to see our examples of our CLDs being used. So the idea here is you've got some drug-related crime in a city. So I'll just put that here. And as drug-related crime goes up, then there are going to be more calls for police action from the community. So because as that increases, it's a plus there. And then as you get more calls for police action, then you can get maybe an increase in the number of police, and then just in general here, sort of skipping some of the steps, we get drug seizures. So we take drugs off the streets. So drug crime leads to more police, leads to more drugs being taken off the street, which the intended outcome and the short-term outcome is then a reduction in the drug-related crime. I'll put that on the other side just to make it a little more obvious. So if I look at this loop, it has one negative link. So what type of loop is that? Is it a balancing negative? Yeah, exactly right. So it's a balancing feedback loop. And so, and that is how it's supposed to function. So this is our example here of bounded rationality, because we're going to say, if I only consider these three variables, this is a this police approach is a rational policy. And we'll see what I mean here. We're going to add more stuff underneath here. So, so this is, we could say, we're going to call the fix, simple fix. So drugs, people don't like it, take them off the streets, reduces the drugs. And it's balancing because the ideal number of drugs on the street would be 0. And so if it goes above 0, feedback loop kicks in, brings it back down to 0. So it's balancing. It keeps things back in balance rather than at 0. All right, so that's fine. But what we don't realize is that behind the scenes, there's other things that are going to happen that we didn't include in our mental model when we came up with this kind of quick fix. And so one of the things is like, well, yeah, I took the drugs off the street. Maybe I got rid of the drug-related crime. The other thing it did is it reduced the supply of drugs. So, so if I have drug supply down here, so if you have more seizures, you have less drug supply. But if I think about it, the drug demand hasn't changed. So this is an exogenous variable. Nothing is going to go into it. But I know that by microeconomics, supply and demand determine price. So I know that if my demand were to go up, the price would go up. I know that if my supply here, to figure out this arrow, I have to say, well, supply goes up, price goes down, or the other way around, if supply goes down, price goes up. So that implies that this is a negative link there. But then if I imagine my drug price is going to increase, then that's going to probably draw more attention to those who supply drugs, or more attention, that's going to get more reaction from those who need the drugs. And over time, drug-related crime. So if the drug price goes up, the drug-related crime goes up, and maybe that's after some delay here. So I'll just write delay here as a reminder. That's what that means. And so the idea here is if I now look at this new feedback loop that has been formed, there's a feedback loop that goes drug-related crime, the wrong tool, drug-related crime, calls for police action, drug seizures, drug supply, drug price, drug-related crime. Well, if I go around that loop, I see a plus, one minus, two minuses, another plus. So now there's two negative links. So what type of loop is this loop? Is it a balancing or a reinforcing? It's a reinforcing loop, right? So I'll put this here as a reinforcing loop. And this is what we might call a crime spiral. So it is a vicious cycle. So this is what we mean by bounded rationality, is that these here were previously excluded variables. In our decision-making model. And when we include them, then we can actually predict that in the short term, we'll see a reduction in drug-related crime, but there is a strong possibility that in the long term, the effect on drug price going up will actually invite drug-related crime to return and maybe even get worse. So this overall matches the archetype that we've seen before, fixes that fail. Because it's a short-term fix that in the long term just gets, it nullifies the fix and the problem comes back, and you might get side effects that are even worse than some of the original problems that you had. So that's an example of an application of bounded rationality to decision-making about this social problem that fits well this systems archetype, fixes that fail, that tells us that we probably need to be looking at the more fundamental issue, which you might argue is like, well, if the drug demand is always constant, then that's really something that maybe that's where you should be focusing the policy on, not necessarily just taking the drugs off the street. Because if you take the drugs off the street, but there's still a demand for them, I mean, those who are addicts have what economists would call drugs are very price inelastic. So if you're an addict, if the price of a drug goes up, you're still likely to find some way to buy it. It's not like something you're not addicted to. If the price goes up, you say, oh, it's too much for me and I won't buy it. So the normal feedbacks here that in the normal market, where if drug price were to go up would prevent people from buying it, aren't going to apply. People know that if you're in a market where the drug price manages to stay very high, then people are going to buy it for that. And so that is what's going to keep inviting the drug-related crime to come back. All right, so that's an example of that. Any questions about that, the crime spiral? and how this is an example of bounded rationality. So remember, it was rational only consider these three variables, but in reality, the system, for this to be a good model of the real system, we might need to include additional variables that were previously excluded. And once you include those, then it suggests that maybe this policy of adding the police isn't the best policy for this particular system. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So really what the system archetypes do is um, they help you get to asking the question, did I include enough? So, it may actually be that in many systems, like maybe even you're in a particular market for a particular drug where this crime spiral won't happen because you don't have as much of an addiction problem. But the idea here is a lot of people will present this feedback loop as saying that's going to fix the problem. And so what a systems thinker would say is, before we move on to the next topic, let's make sure that there aren't additional variables that might have a lower, so I'd call this a longer time scale, a slower loop that could come back to hurt us. So I'm not saying that this always happens, but I can say that there are drug markets where this, has come back. So whenever you implement a simple fix, this trap suggests that you should look to make sure there's not slower feedbacks that you've left out. Because that's in all of modeling, the big problem is what to exclude. How do I figure out when it's okay to exclude? Because I need to exclude things. I cannot consider every single variable in the world for every single decision. So at what point have I made the model complex enough or complicated enough for me to make a good decision? And the traps help guide us to see if we need to add a little more. And at what point have we sort of like, okay, I can't figure out, if you can't find anything that would apply here, then maybe your simple loop is fine. So, but if you start thinking about it, then you can think, well, what are the other things that happen when I take drugs off the street? Then you start adding those things in, and then suddenly these traps pop out. You say, oh, shoot, there's a fixes the fail trap here. Okay, any other questions about that? Great question. My tablet and laptop have Borgified and are sharing the mouse. So I had to fight to get it back. All right, so this is also kind of another example of bounded rationality that's kind of happens a lot in policy, is what we refer to as policy resistance. And this is another example of bounded rationality. And so what I'm going to walk through here is an example that I borrowed from I borrowed and sort of embellished from the Meadows textbook. I have an optional reading you can read in this unit from Meadows, the 2008 textbook, chapter 5. And they have a whole section on traps. And I like the examples she's picked out, but sometimes I don't think she does as well with mapping to the archetypes for when it's all in text. None of it's sort of drawn out. So that's why I don't have you read it. But I think she has a lot of great sort of historical examples. And this is one of them. And what we're going to see here is there's like at least 4 archetypes that you can use to look at this problem that help reveal different aspects of where a policy went wrong and what the right policy should have been. So this example comes from Romania. And so this was in around, say, 1967, Romania had a sort of a dictator that was concerned about the country's population growth. So I'll say a Romanian population growth. And so the dictator noticed that the population was not growing quite as fast, and so made the decision to outlaw abortions for any woman under 45 years of age. And so the idea there was that okay, so I got to draw this backwards. I can say, well, there's population growth is the focus, and so we know that legal abortions decrease population growth. So what they decided to do is put in abortion controls or laws against abortion. And abortion controls will reduce the number of legal abortions. And so the thought here is that if you have a decrease in population, you'll have an increase in abortion controls. So that ends up being the loop here. So the decision making here was, we're going to implement a policy where if as the population growth decreases below the rate that is desired, then implement abortion controls, and then take advantage of this pathway where if we implement abortion controls, that will stop abortions, which will increase population growth. And if you look at this loop, this policy loop, it's got 3 negatives. And so that would suggest 3 negatives. Would this be a balancing feedback loop or a reinforcing feedback loop? Balancing, right. So, but a balancing feedback loop here. Right, so that's the policy. That's what they put in mind. And what they found in the short term is that in the late 60s, population growth started to take off in Romania for a short period of time. But then what they ended up finding shortly after that is it started to come back down to its original numbers. And there were a bunch of interesting side effects. And so this is going to be another example of a short-term fix that fails, and that's due to bounded rationality. So what was left out in this leader's decision making is that when you start putting these draconian abortion controls in play, other stuff happens. There is a behavioral response in this Romanian population. And so what they also found is that once these abortion controls were enacted, then after a little bit of time, there was an increase in illegal abortions. So an increase in abortion controls after maybe a slight delay as the infrastructure gets set up, then you get an increase in illegal abortions. And those illegal abortions then, of course, have a effect of reducing population growth. On top of that, these illegal abortions increased. There were a lot of an increase in maternal mortality. And so women getting these illegal abortions were dying, some of them, a fraction of them, and that has a decrease as a negative effect on population growth. And then on top of that, what they also found is that a lot of women who didn't go through an illegal abortion were actually leaving their babies up somewhere. So they either would give them away for adoption or they would just abandon them. So there was a lot of abandonment of these children. So there was a, I'll say child abandonment. And that occurred after some delay. And that delay here is because it takes time for these children to get to the point where they're ready to be abandoned. And then that doesn't necessarily mean that those children are going to die, but that definitely does not give them as great of survival chances as the average person. And so if we look at all of these working back around here, then I can see that there's several loops that got formed here. So there's if I go population growth, that's a negative. Here's a positive. And here is another negative. So that's two negatives. So that means that that is a reinforcing loop. And then I see here that, and sort of you meant to, think about this example here, just kind of all over again. So then we also see that this negative, if I follow this down, there's a positive, here's a positive, another negative. So now I've got another reinforcing loop. And then if I do that again for this one down here, this negative, positive, this negative again, so that's two negatives, so another reinforcing loop. So what we see is that we now have these three processes that are actually working against this balancing loop, so that you end up getting an ultimate sort of failure in the policy that's trying to increase population growth through abortion controls. And what you actually get is a restoral of people planning out their own reproductive decisions. But because there's no legal pathway for that, it creates this illegal side effect of increased child abandonment and mortality, and so on. And so you get ultimately, in the long run, you don't achieve the population growth, and you increase all of these side effects. And so these side effects actually had the effect of eventually this accumulated so much distrust in this leader that the leader of Romania was overthrown, killed, and his family was killed. And the person who took over, their first thing that they did was get rid of this law. So it's an example of a fix that fails. And not only does it fail to do what you wanted to do, but it creates so many side effects that actually creates, it can actually put the decision maker back in jeopardy. So it highlights that you really need to consider these kind of long-term things here. So again, I would call this fixes that fail. And then this actually, again, led to the leader was overthrown and killed with family, and replaced by another leader who the first thing they did was got rid of that law. All right, so questions about this, how this is a fixes that fail. Short-term response is positive, long-term response is very negative. All right, so when we look at that, that's kind of our one, we think about that as archetype choice one, to think about this Romanian problem. But we'd like to have other lenses to sort of understand, okay, well, fine, that describes why this failed, but how do we get to a better solution? Like, this population growth issue seemed to be an important issue, that there were real problems in Romania that the economic theory of that time, at least, suggested that you needed population growth. Like, they just needed more people in the country in order to sustain their economy. So what was the fundamental problem that was preventing the population from growing? And what's a potential solution other than this one that they could get to? And so let's, we can think about using other archetypes to look into other aspects of this. And so I want to introduce then, a different archetype. So this is on the subject of lenses from, Kim and Lannon. That paper, the article that we read last time. And so the other archetype that I want to look at here for this problem in Romania will be the escalation archetype. And so, and this is also this commonly comes up as one of these policy resistance. So policy resistance often admits compatibility with fixes that fail, as well as escalation. So we want to look at it and say, is there an escalation here? And if there is, does that tell us something interesting about the system? And so if we think about this, an escalation, and I'll just draw a little diagram underneath here, an escalation is two balancing loops that sort of are in opposition to each other. And so the two balancing loops here is we have a target population that the government would like to hit. And we have the actual population and there's going to be some deficit between the target population and the actual population, a gap. So if your target population goes up, the deficit goes up. If the actual population goes up, the deficit goes down. Now, if you have that deficit, then the solution that the Romanians implemented were abortion controls. So as the deficit increases, so do the abortion controls. The abortion controls change the number of legal abortions so with more abortion controls, you have less legal abortions. And the legal abortions, if you had more legal abortions, you would have less population. So if I look around there, I have three negatives. So 1, 1, 1. So that is the balancing loop here. Fine. So that's kind of what we already knew, but now we've casted it with an explicit kind of target population there. So what's going on in the other loop that's fighting against it? So, well, if we think about it, as the actual population goes up, there's a limited number of resources in Romania. So the amount of per capita resources, the resources that are available for each individual person in Romania is going to decrease so long as there's the fixed capacity of resources stays the same. So as the actual population goes up, we're going to say that the per capita resources, so the per capita is just a fancy word for divide by the population. So total number of resources divided by population. So the per capita resources, so the actual population goes up, the amount of per capita resources goes down. So if you think about it, there's maybe a certain number of resources needed for an individual to raise a child, to raise a new child. And then there would be surplus resources. So basically, if you've got your per capita resources, you can imagine subtracting off the resources needed to raise a child, and whatever the surplus was, that would be what's kind of left over for survival of the person making the decision. So as the per capita resources would increase, so would the surplus. But as the resources needed for a child would increase, the surplus would decrease. So we have those relationships there. Then we think, okay, well, with those surplus resources, that is really what's driving someone to decide whether they're going to have a child or not. And if, so in this case, we can put the illegal abortions in as the decision. And so the suggestion here is that if the amount of resources they have increases, then the number of illegal abortions would decrease, and vice versa. If the amount of resources the individual has decreases, the probability to have an abortion would increase. And then the illegal abortions has the same effect on the actual population as legal abortion. So now if I look around this loop, I've got a negative, a negative, and a negative, and yep, it is another balancing loop. So sometimes we like to label these loops. We just put a little label above them. So I could call this like the policy loop. And I'll call this maybe the survival loop. So I didn't really change much about the narrative. But by drawing it this way, what I'm doing is highlighting that under this dynamic theory, then what we're suggesting is that the driver for people having abortions is that they just don't have the resources to carry things through. And so it seems like maybe the fundamental problem has to do with the amount of resources they start with. So maybe we're reaching capacity limits for the population. And if we want to enact a policy, we need to address the capacity limits as opposed to forcing people into trying to make decisions that don't resolve the fundamental problem that they just don't have the resources. And so, so that's kind of the Romanian side of things. And to sort of test this is that there's actually, Hungary is not too much farther away. And Hungary at the same time had the same problem, low population, but they enacted policies that affected this resources side and had a very different outcome. So, so I'll get to that here in a second. But so any questions on this, on how this is on either of these loops? You see how these are both balancing loops? You see how the links are set? And we refer to this as an escalation because this loop ultimately wants to bring population up to target population, but this loop ultimately wants to allow the kind of surplus resources to be enough for an individual to survive. And those two things are in opposition here, because as you squeeze more population out of your citizens, then each individual citizen has less left for themselves to survive, and vice versa. Yeah. For this, yeah, so I guess also maybe I'll call this dueling balancing loops. So behavior over time for an escalation, the details of this would, it's going to vary a little bit in the delay. Let me bring up, rather than me trying to draw one, let me just bring up the cartoon from Kim and Lannon. Sure, they've got it. So, so the generic escalation here is going to be something like this, where you've got, we're modeling the kind of the policy action and the response. And so you can think of this as sort of like we're going to make, tighter and tighter population controls, but then we're going to get a response where we get, more and more illegal activity. And so as these two go back and forth, then you never actually relieve this tension. So you never actually maybe get a higher population. But as the population stays fixed, so its behavior over time will kind of be flat, then these things out here are going to end up just kind of going off to everywhere. So this often, and I guess I could draw this now, but when we look at these when we look at these escalations, we often think of them as figure eights. So if you start at one of the outside loops and follow it around and come back to itself, the figure 8, if you view that as sort of a meta loop, will be a reinforcing loop. So it's almost like you get a balancing effect for the thing in the middle, but the things on the outside are reinforced. They have reinforced growth, and they just grow and grow and grow. And because they're both growing, then the thing in the middle stays stable. So it looks like nothing's happening, but there's a lot going on here. And actually, that's on that note. Actually, that's actually a good opportunity for us before we see what Hungary did. Let's actually think a little bit more about escalations. I'm going to give you a couple of other examples of escalations. So let's think, other examples of escalations. So one of them is Prohibition. So in the 20s, outlaw alcohol, and so that was an attempt to solve a particular problem. So we have an alcohol supply. And so the policy was to increase law enforcement to enforce laws that reduced the alcohol supply. And so that was kind of the prohibition loop, but the demand for alcohol was still there. So the alcohol supply, we could map it coming up, and we can think about the price and the demand for alcohol. And we know that if demand for alcohol goes up, price goes up. We know if supply of alcohol goes down, price goes up. So this one's a minus here. Or in other words, if alcohol supply goes up, price goes down. Either way, that link is a minus. And then that, we know that if price goes up, then black market production will go up. There'll be an attraction to it despite the risks from the law. And if black market production is available, then the alcohol supply just gets reinforced, or just gets, you end up getting this compensatory effect. So this loop is trying to bring alcohol to zero. And then this is trying to maximize profit. So basically is trying to keep alcohol in the system. And so the alcohol supply ends up, so this alcohol supply basically stays constant while there's increasing effort to catch it all in law enforcement. And over here, there is increased activity, crime. So this policy was meant to just get rid of all the alcohol, but still there's demand for alcohol. And so it created basically all of this gang activity, this mob activity in producing this alcohol here. And once, in the 33, when they finally said, okay, let's stop prohibition. When prohibition ends, all of this crazy activity, this crime activity, basically ends itself. I mean, you got other things, but the alcohol-related one. So a lot of times in these escalations, sometimes the best thing to do is just stop rather than trying, like you can try to overpower. You can say, well, if we can just eventually, if we can keep putting support into law enforcement and we get faster and just overwhelm the black market production is going to give up because it just won't be worth their effort to produce it. But more often than not, you'll run out of resources before the other party will run out of resources. So you're running the risk that that's going to happen. So the counterintuitive thing about escalations is that very often the best thing to do is to just get rid of the policy that started the escalation. And a lot of times the system problem just takes care of itself, and it allows you to focus on things like, why is there so much alcohol demand? Maybe that's where we need to be putting our policy effort, not into just getting rid of the alcohol. That's another example of escalation. And I want to give two more quick examples. Any questions on this one? I didn't add a lot of variables here. Another common example is road construction. And so, we see this in like every city, including Phoenix. There's a travel time issue. So of course, as people's travel time gets long, then there's a pressure to reduce congestion. From everybody who lives there. So as travel time increases, then you get an increased pressure to reduce congestion, which leads to road construction. And then road construction, it takes a while, but after a few years, then you get increased highway capacity. So notice I'm just going to write highway capacity, not increased highway capacity. So with increased road construction, you get increased highway capacity, but that's after a delay. So I'm going to put the little delay markers there. And then after that, finally then, with increased highway capacity, we then get relief. Travel time gets relief. And that becomes this nice balancing loop. And that looks like it's going to fix all our problems. But the thing is, like, if you do manage to make travel time less, you have the side effect that you increase the attractiveness of driving. So as travel time decreases, the attractiveness of driving increases. And so then the trips per day, as you increase attractiveness, trips per day increases. So that's going to increase the total volume. So total traffic volume. And so trips per day increases traffic volume. And then that traffic volume goes back and increases the travel time. And if I look around that loop, it's got one negative. That's a balancing loop. So basically, this balancing loop is trying to bring travel time down to zero, ideally, like light speed. But this balancing loop brings it right back up to where it started. Because, because if you make it more attractive to drive, then people are going to populate your roads and they're going to come right back to where things were initially. And on top of that, if you increase the attractiveness of driving, then, it has public transit side effects. So public transit ridership. So I'll put a delay here because you can imagine that over time, people say, wow, it's so easy to drive, I'll go buy a car. And it might take them time to do that. But then in the long run, it's going to decrease public transit ridership, which is going to decrease cars per person. Or so if you were to increase public transit ridership, it would decrease cars per person. But the effect will be the reduction in ridership will increase cars per person. Cars per person will change the number of cars in the region. So if you increase cars per person, you increase cars in region, and that is just going to come back and increase the traffic volume. And if I look around this big loop, negative, 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 all positives, then that itself is another balancing loop that's just sort of going in the same direction as this balancing loop. So you end up getting these side effects that prevent travel time reductions. And as before, travel time, the thing in the middle stays constant, but it seems like you have endless road construction, and it seems like public transit ridership and the number of cars per person or cars in region just keeps increasing forever. So you end up getting growth in these variables, even though they're participating in a balancing loop, while this variable stays the same. And that's the conundrum you get in most cities, right? And that suggests that maybe the policy shouldn't be to build more roads. Maybe it should be to do other things to maybe affect the attractiveness of driving. So maybe the goal shouldn't effectively, implicitly be to make it more attractive to drive. Maybe public transit ridership needs to be made more attractive. Maybe other investments should be made, those sorts of things. Maybe that will get at a more fundamental problem. Questions about that example? All right, and then the last kind of common example of escalation that I want to bring up here is the Cold War, or just generally arms races in general. So you can get, the Cold War, which is an example, or really any arms race. You have an example where you have, in the center, it's about perception. And so you have sort of US weapons. So we're talking about the 80s, although increasingly feels more and more like today. But so you've got US weapons, or US weapons superiority, I guess, but I'll say US weapons advantage over USSR weapons. So we can measure that, this sort of relative thing, US versus USSR. And if the US feels that it's losing some of its advantage, then what's it going to do? It is going to invest. You'll get an investment in US weapons. All right, so just to sort of see who's paying attention here. So what do you think this polarity should be? I said that if you get a drop in the US weapons advantage, you'll get an increase in investment. So should this be a positive or a negative? How many people say positive? How many people say negative? Great, yes. So this should be a negative right there. And after an investment in weapons, you'll eventually get new US weapons. And this is one of those examples where I'm going to put a little delay mark there, because I want to indicate it takes a while to build these things. And then that, when you get those new US weapons, so then that will increase the US weapons advantage, and that ends up being a balancing loop. But there's the mirror process is going on in the USSR. So in the USSR, they see that this change in this quantity, so they're going to invest, so investment in USSR weapons. So if the US weapons advantage grows, then the investment in USSR weapons will also grow. So that's a plus on this side. That will increase the new USSR weapons after a delay. And then that will end up decreasing the US's advantage over time. And so that ends up being a balancing loop in this direction. And that's our escalation, these two. So this, this quantity wants to be brought to infinity by the US. It wants to be brought to zero by this one. So they both end up duking it out, and it pretty much stays fixed. But what the world sees is the US and USSR developing huge arsenals of weapons that aren't being used, but but new types of weapons are being introduced, and so on and so forth. And so eventually what happens is this engine burns out. Eventually one of these sides goes bankrupt. In this, in our history, it happened to be the USSR went bankrupt, and they had to give up. They'd to stop developing new weapons. And that stopped this escalation. But it stopped it, and the world had a huge number of new weapons in these two superpowers that, probably, wasn't an improvement in the world's sort of peace, is that to suddenly have all of these new weapons that were just there to maintain this escalation. So in all of these cases, you've got a stable quantity in the middle, and then you've got these two quantities on the edges. And if we sort of trace a figure 8 around, so if I were to start from one of these, go through the stable quantity, go through the other, and come back, then this figure 8 that's formed itself is, you can think of it as having, let's say, a minus and a plus, and then a plus and a minus. So the figure 8 itself, even though the two loops are balancing, the figure 8 acts reinforcing in figure 8. Now, normally we can't, analyze a loop by creating these meta loops, these figure 8s or whatever. But the particular structure of the escalation, the way this thing works, happens to be that one balancing loop kind of nullifies the other balancing loop, which allows this sort of figure 8 logic to work. So even though the thing in the middle is stable, the things on the outside are effectively participating in a reinforcing loop with each other. So an increase in this variable leads to increases in this variable, which leads to increases in this variable, and they just grow and grow and grow. And that's an escalation. Which is why it's good to not get into escalations. There are some positive escalations, but they're probably not going to last forever. So it's not usually a sustainable policy to get into an escalation. So like you could say I'm going to give you a compliment. Well, then I have to give you a compliment, back and forth, back and forth. Well, eventually, there's someone, keels over from nausea or something, or you just run out of time. And so it's it's maybe find a different way to get along with each other than just having to constantly go back and forth. Or they actually talk about in a lot of cultures, like in cultures where you bow, there's often I bow lower than you to respect you, and you bow lower than me to respect me, and it goes back and forth. And very often, to prevent someone from hitting their head on the table, there's an asymmetry, there's a symmetry breaking where someone actually drinks their drink before the other person gets an opportunity to respond, and that ends it. And so it's an opportunity to end it before it gets too silly. So escalations are usually better being ended than continued. So any questions about escalation in these examples? All right, we've got a little bit of time left, so I'm going to go back to Romania and Hungary and demonstrate two more of these archetypes that help us think about this problem. So back to Romania and Hungary. All right, so ultimately in Romania, what we're getting at is that there were just not enough resources to really sustain growth. And that suggests that maybe we shouldn't be looking at these balancing based archetypes that, if you think about that archetype family tree I showed you, at the very top of the phylogeny, the very top of the family tree, you can either say, I'm going to pick an archetype that solves the problem, and that's a balancing loop, or I'm going to pick an archetype that addresses growth. And really, population growth feels like it should be a growth loop. So that suggests that maybe a better lens to be looking at here is archetype 3 to looking at Romania. And this is sort of what Hungary was doing when they looked at their problem. And that's the limits to growth archetype. And if you kind of know that this archetype exists, then you kind of know that, like, oh, wow, we're hitting a limit to growth. What is that fundamental limit? And that helps us address what policy to do here. So I'm going to keep this one kind of simple. So if I do population in the center here, and I'll do growth rate out here, I know that without worrying about limitations, the more growth you have, the more population you get. And the more population you get, the more growth you have. And that's a reinforcing loop. Any population model is going to have this simple natural population growth. This is our background population growth. So I'll just say natural population growth. So regardless of what anyone's family planning goals are, if we zoom out and think about the whole population, then there's going to be some people who want to have children, some people who don't, but there always will be some people who want to have children. They will contribute to positive growth, which will cause the population to grow. And the number of people, if we consider 60% or whatever, that want to have children, well, the absolute number of them will grow, even if the relative number stays 60%, and then that allows this thing to grow. So that's a basic natural population growth. Now, if we think about it, though, that can't go on forever. So on the other side of it, we can say, well, as you increase the population, as we saw, the per capita resources available decreased. So as you increase population, per capita resources decrease. And that, if you were to increase per capita resources, that would increase your population. But because of this negative link up top, then this becomes a balancing loop, which is effectively what we're going to call a capacity constraint. And that by itself, those two loops together are what we refer as enough for us to call that limits to growth. A growth loop with a capacity constraint here. Now, in the Hungary case, on top of that, we actually have a behavioral response. So this applies to anything, fish, humans, or whatever. But the humans in this example also had one more feedback, those abortions. And so in that case, I can put abortions down here. And I can say, as the per capita resources available decrease, or then abortions will increase. So that's going to put a negative in front of that. And this is legal or illegal. It doesn't matter. And then as the number of abortions increase, the growth rate decreases. So what I can see there is I've now got this additional, so positive, 1 negative, 2 negatives, 3 negatives. And so that is an additional balancing feedback group. And so that is why we emphasize limits. You can have multiple limitations on growth. So you've got the fundamental limit that's just maybe not physiologically possible to produce another offspring without a certain number of resources available. And then you've got actually as resources become less available, there's an increased behavioral decision not to even go through with that. And so you've got an additional limit. So limits to growth shows us that actually maybe per capita resources available is a really important thing. And if we could adjust that then we could allow this to grow for longer. So that gets us to our final archetype. So, we can say the fundamental problem here is these per capita resources available. So, so that finally gets us to the last archetype I want to map to this, which is shifting the burden. So archetype number 4. Shifting the burden. And so shifting the burden is kind of like a comparison between Romania and Hungary all in one. So in shifting the burden, we put population growth center as the kind of problem that we need to solve. And we're going to have a short-term fix and a fundamental fix. So the short-term fix that Romania did was they did abortion control laws. And so as you, and then I'll put abortions up here. So as you increase abortion control laws, you decrease abortions. Abortions themselves decrease population growth. And as population growth decreases, abortion control laws kick in. So we get this balancing loop, but this is our symptomatic solution. So it's fixing a symptom. It's not fixing the fundamental problem. So, and this is kind of what Romania did. But what was employed in Hungary and was far more effective, and you can read more about this in Meadows if you'd like, is that they made investments in services/resources. In particular, what they did in Hungary is they said larger families, they actually gave them bigger houses. So they increased the amount of resources they had available based on the family size there. So in this case, as the population growth decreased, then you got an increase in the investments. And as you got an increase in those investments, then the per capita resources also increased. And as the per capita resources increased, the population growth increased. And that became a new balancing loop. And that is what we'd say is the fundamental solution. And if we're to model, and this is kind of like what Hungary did, now in shifting the burden, the emphasis is not only if you take the symptomatic solution, it's the wrong solution, you actually make it harder to do the fundamental solution. So a side effect of the symptomatic solution is a decrease in the fundamental solution. So if I look at this feedback, negative, positive, positive, and then these abortion control laws, I meant to mark that as a negative as well. Oh no, there, it's marked as a negative. Maybe I'll connect this better. So, so I can see here that I've got a negative and a negative. So that's a two, that together is a reinforcing feedback. And so that is our side effect. And so the correct burden, the person who should hold the burden should be the government to increase capacity. But the Romanian solution shifted burden to individuals. And so that's what we mean by it's a shifting the burden, is that the fundamental solution requires a certain type of effort, but there is a quicker symptomatic solution requires a different type of effort. But when you take it, then it becomes even less likely that you're going to do the fundamental solution. And so it is a shift of burden to sort of into the wrong place. And then the problem comes back to haunt you later. And that's basically quite a, sort of a summary of that. And there's a bunch of, if you look at the instructor notes that I posted online, I've got some other examples of shifting the burden that aren't, tied to this particular example in history, sort of more generic ones. But that's where we get the name. And I'm hoping that now that we've walked through this, we started with fixes that fail, we ended with shifting the burden. I know a lot of you said you had a hard time in the muddiest points and things like that, discriminating between those two. And I'm hoping this march from fixes to fail to shifting the burden helps you see the difference between those two archetypes. They sort of help you focus on different things. But that's all I want to get to today. Again, I got some other sort of examples in here that if we had time, I was going to get to them, but they're just examples. There are more examples than that. You'll see more examples on assignment A or B2. If you need other examples, like I'm really having a hard time with this archetype, just send me a note. And I'd be happy to send you some other types of examples and a bunch of resources online. So with that, let me give you the attendance slide. And so the question I have here is, what is the only archetype that we're allowed to sort of use figure eights to reason about? So we're allowed to sort of couple loops together into a figure eight. What's the archetype that's associated with sort of the figure eight interpretation? And that's all I've got for you. So you got the weekend reminders. Tuesday is another normal class. We'll start Unit C on resilience. Take a look at the reading. I'll have that reading exercise available for you very shortly. If you need anything else, I'll be up here. Otherwise, that's all I've got.